Hello and welcome back to my channel. So in this episode I'm going to talk you through the setup of the Canon R3 for sports and I guess for wildlife as well, but this is mostly for sports photography, and this is how I set up the Canon R3. It's a bit of a learning curve. It's a little bit different to the 1DX and the Canon the 5D, the old Mark IV and Mark III cameras. It's a bit of a learning curve. There's a lot of new features in here, especially the autofocusing system and things like that. There is a bit of a process to get it set up how you would like it to work for that kind of really precise focusing, autofocusing, eye tracking capability of the camera. Once you've got it working, it is absolutely just amazing. I mean, it's just the most brilliant piece of equipment I've ever used, I have to admit. So you really need to kind of dig deep into the focusing settings and kind of tweak it. But once you've got it, you won't feel like it's been a waste of time. Let's make a start by going through the settings here. So first of all, you want to look at the top, the mode setting. You have FV, which is flexible priority. You have P, program AE, aperture priority, which is AE. You have manual, which is M, and you have TV, which is shutter priority. And you've got bulb. And then you've got three custom settings that you can assign. I've basically used C3, which is a flexible priority custom setup. So I'll show you how to do that later on. But first of all, you need to select flexible priority AE. My preference is flexible priority. It's one of those settings where I'm thinking, why would I want to use anything else? And it is literally like that. It's such a massive improvement of my kind of overall ability to be able to control the camera and change settings very, very quickly. And so you can see here what the flexible priority does. It allows you to scroll between all the settings using one of the dials on the camera, and it is the top dial. I personally feel that that is the best program mode for sports photography. You notice here that ISO is normally set to auto. I mean, you can assign a value to the ISO, but better off being left in auto. First of all, we're going to go into the red menu zone and look at JPEG. Kind of want the best quality JPEG possible. So you can assign maximum 10 to JPEG L. I generally still shoot in RAW and JPEG, but I switch it to C-RAW just to save file space. Most of the images for sports that take off the card are the JPEG versions because it's not really necessary to do so much editing for editorial style shooting, but I've got the raw files just in case I need to fall back onto that. So it's kind of useful. So cropping aspect ratio will be set to full, but there are occasions when I want to crop it in, and you do have that functionality to be able to use that 1.6 times crop. And that's pretty useful, but I do assign a separate button to be able to control that when I'm in the field shooting. So go on to the second bank of the red menu system. So we want to move down to ISO speed settings, and ISO speed is set to auto, and ISO speed range can actually go from L50 all the way up to 102,400. So you might as well just set that. The ISO speed range can go higher. I generally set it to 25,600. That's the auto range. So when the ISO is in auto, it's only going to go between those settings. It's not going to go any further than that. I personally find that anything above 25,600 is beginning to be a little bit unusable. So that is really why I set that limit. I don't really want it to go any higher than that. Never had a situation where I really needed to. You're practically shooting in the dark. I mean, you just don't really need it. So we're going on to auto light optimizer set to standard. Anti-flicker shooting. I generally disable the anti-flicker shoot, but I would enable it if I needed to. And the camera normally gives me a warning if I need to turn that flicker on, the anti-flicker shoot, and it's normally something to do with the floodlights in the stadium. If there is a certain type of floodlight, then you will get a flicker, but generally I leave it off, just turn it on as and when you need it. So metering mode, I generally use evaluative metering. I don't really go towards the other ones. Partial metering, spot metering, center weighted average. I generally leave it on evaluative. Okay, so we're going on to the fourth bank. White balance is always a bit of a tricky one. I generally use, as a sort of default, I use auto white balance, but if you press the info button on the camera, I actually set the auto white balance from ambient priority to white priority, and I find that generally gives me much more accurate colors. But there would be occasions when if you've got a really tricky lighting environment, then I would literally use the custom color temp and I would set the white balance myself. So you can basically scroll up and down and set your own color temperature. Sometimes that will give you better options, but for now, as a default, I will just set auto white balance but white priority. But you can set custom white balance like by photographing like a, a white piece of paper or a grey card or something like that. It really is down to you to be able to do that. But you can also set white balance shift and shift bracketing. By using the joystick, you can kind of shift the color tone, and then that could be pretty useful. Color space, I'll generally leave it on sRGB instead of the Adobe RGB. For color standards, it's generally more acceptable for use on the web. I think sRGB has slightly wider color gamut than Adobe RGB. So picture style, I have auto selected. So within the auto picture style, I generally have a sort of custom setup. So I've made a few changes here. So when it comes to sharpness, strength, I've kind of bumped that up to sort of like a +1 from the default. Fineness, again, I've bumped that up into the middle. Threshold, I've moved that up. Contrast, now this is the interesting bit. Contrast, I've moved that down to -3, and the saturation, I generally leave it on 0, color tone again on 0. So the one to focus on is the contrast. I bring the contrast right down, and the reason for that is because I generally shoot in JPEG, and when I come down to the final edit, I don't really want to do a lot of editing. A lot of the time you're kind of balancing the white and blacks to stop it from underexposing and preventing it from overexposing. What I find with bringing the contrast down is that it controls those blacks a lot better, so you don't get an image that looks like it's very dark in the shadows, for example. And again, it's entirely down to you to set your own parameters, really. I mean, this is just a guide, and you do have these sort of user-defined standard picture styles. You can just use one of those and assign all your modified settings to that, but I just generally just use the auto. Clarity, I've just pushed it up by 1, just a +1 there for clarity. Lens aberration correction is, I think they're just like the default settings. I think that's fine. Don't need to do anything there. So high ISO noise reduction set to auto, and also multiple exposure disabled. In the 7th bank of the red menu setting, drive mode, you're going to want high speed continuous plus. So that's going to give you that 30 frames per second in the electronic shutter and 12, I think, in the mechanical. In electronic first person, that I think is fine. I think if you're shooting sports, you really need that high speed continuous plus. So you need to get the most out of the camera. If you've got it, you might as well use it. There's no point in having 30 frames a second or 12 frames per second if you're not going to be able to use it. So you might as well just leave it on high speed continuous plus. Okay, so I'm going to go down to shutter mode. Oh, silent shutter is off for now. So you go down to shutter mode, and electronic first curtain is what I generally use. Electronic is the other mode I would use. Generally, I leave it in electronic first curtain for now. If I feel like I really need to have more frames per second, then I would switch it to electronic shutter. But electronic first curtain is generally fine. Release shutter without card. Really important that this is disabled. Like, absolutely really important, because if you forget to put a card in, the camera will just operate as if you have a card in the slot, and you could be shooting all day and not realize you haven't put a card in. So release shutter without card off. Right, so into the next bank. Image stabilization is always on. Yep, always. Still photo IS always. Touch, customized quick controls, edit layout. I don't really bother with this. This is the customization of the quick controls. I'm fine with it the way that it is, sort of the default settings, so I generally just leave it alone. The touch shutter is disabled. I don't really want to be accidentally firing the shutter if I touch the screen. Image review, 2 seconds, yeah, fine, not a problem. In the 9th bank, we've got display simulation, don't really touch it. Shooting info display, I think I'm okay with that, and yeah, no problems there. Just leave it as it is. Okay, so we're in the purple area, which is autofocus of the menu system. So AF operation is set to servo instead of one shot. Okay, so AF area, I generally leave it on 1 point AF. You do have expand AF area and various other ones, but I find that that's fine. Subject tracking is set to off. Subject to detect is set to people. Eye detection enabled, and switching track subject is on 1, which is default. Now, the 2nd bank, this is where it gets kind of really interesting for the autofocusing setup. You've got servo AF, and you've got 5 different modes here. Personally, I'm always in case 2, which is continue to track subjects, ignoring possible obstacles. And I actually make a few changes by selecting tracking sensitivity and then using the rate button. you're able to go in and you're able to make some adjustments there. So I normally bring it down to like -2, the tracking sensitivity, and the acceleration, deceleration tracking is normally left on the default. But you can use any of these 5 settings. Really is down to you to try and experiment with all those different settings for different sports and then different types of subjects that you have. I just generally use case 2 for a lot of things, but I do change it every now and again. Into bank 3, one-shot AF release priority, generally put it on focus priority. Preview AF, don't touch it. Lens drive when AF impossible. So that's off. AF assist beam firing is disabled because we don't really have a flash. Bank 4, limit AF areas. So generally only use the spot 1-point AF. So you could actually turn off some of the other ones that aren't going to be used, just to limit the amount of control that the camera has, because you just don't really need to use it, just in case, you know, accidentally put it into a mode that you don't really want. So just take those off. AF area selection control, so main dial, yeah, okay with that. Sensitivity, AF point select, I think default is fine, and orientation linked AF point. So I generally use separate AF points, point only. I find that's a little bit more useful. So manual focus peaking settings, yeah, on. You never know, you might need to switch to manual focus for something, so it's good to have the peaking on, and put it on to level high, and the color, whatever color you want. I use red. I think red's pretty good. Register people priority, not really sure what that does, I've got to be honest, so gonna leave that off for now. So into the 6th bank, so electronic full-time manual focus enables you to focus manually at any time when the camera is ready to use. So yeah, you might as well leave that on. Actually, there might be an occasion where you have to literally switch over to manual control for something that's really difficult to focus on, so you might as well just leave that on. Lens electronic manual focus, yeah, not really sure exactly what to do with that one, so I think I'll just leave it on the default. Focus ring rotation, yeah, don't need to worry about any of that. Now we're going into the sort of the 3rd bank, which is blue, which is playback. The one thing that I do like to change in here is the rate button function. So I generally set it from the default, which is, I think, the star and the voice memo, and I flip it over to protect and voice record memo. And I'll show you why later on, but that's what I do there. And then go back up to image jump. So what I do there, I set that to display protected images only. So basically, as I'm taking photos, I'm locking or protecting the images that I want to keep. So here you can still scroll through all your images, but on the top here, which is what we've just assigned, it's only going to scroll back through protected, and you can see here it's got the little protect sign. It's only going to scroll back through all the images that you've set to be protected. It's almost like that is your sort of selection that you've made as you're kind of shooting throughout the day or throughout the match or the game that you're covering. You go along and you select the images that you want to keep by protecting them, and so this scroll at the top only scrolls through the protected images. Then you can just jump back and that will then scroll back through the images. So that's pretty useful. That's how I set that up, and it's very easy just to change back, so it's not a big deal. So let me move on to bank 5 of playback, and I always have the AF point display enabled. I find that so useful, and playback grid is off. Again, you can turn it on. So now we're going into sort of network settings. I'm just going to set airplane mode to be off so I can have a look at network settings. And I've got to be honest, network setup that's an entirely separate video. I mean, there's so much to that. So for now, I'm just going to leave airplane mode on, and that's just going to cut all the signals, and it's just going to allow me to save some of the battery, which I think is quite important. So on to the 5th bank, which is that sort of mustard color yellow. Record function and card folder setup. I generally only shoot photographs when I'm doing sports. I don't really shoot any video. You might as well just set the photo and video to be separate. But really the only thing I really want to change here is actually on the play. I want to have card 2 as my playback. So I'm shooting JPEG to card 2 and I'm shooting C-RAW to the CF Express card 1. Performance wise, that's perfectly fine. The SD card speed can handle recording the JPEG. It's only when you're doing 30 frames per second shooting RAW, that's really kind of when you need the CF Express card to maintain the buffer and maintain those recording speeds. So I really just set play to 2 and I deactivate card 1 as being priority. File name, I've actually set it up as CR3. And on the other cameras, I've got CR6, CR5, and that's only because I've got 3 different cameras. So I generally need to know what images come from what camera. But using the software, Photo Mechanic software, which is what I generally use, most of the images get renamed anyway, so it really doesn't really matter about the file name. I just do it as a default. When the files are ingested onto the computer, everything goes through Photo Mechanic, everything just gets renamed anyway, automatically, automated process, so I wouldn't worry too much about file name. It really is down to what you prefer. So format card, we're not going to format the card just yet. Auto rotate is set to on. Add rotate information, disabled, yeah. Okay, so date, time zone, this is kind of important to make sure that you properly set your cameras up for the actual time zone that you're in. Actually have a proper accurate time. Well, as accurate as you can. I mean, it's pretty easy to set up, so make sure you do that. You do that on all the cameras that you have. Language is set to English for me, but whatever you prefer. Video system is set to PAL, don't really need it because I'm not really shooting video. Okay, so the beep is disabled. That is the noise that the camera makes every time you touch one of the buttons. Probably the most annoying thing ever. So just take the beep off. You just don't want it beeping around all the time. It's going to drive people mad. Power saving. Screen dimmer was initially set to 10 seconds. But I'm not too bothered about screen dimmer. The screen off though is set to 30 seconds. Auto power off, I've gone from 15 seconds to 3 minutes. I don't really want the camera kind of just turning itself off because it can take, you know, a few seconds for it to start up again. The moment could have gone, even just that split second of the camera just kind of booting back up. Kind of want auto power off set to 3 minutes, maybe even a bit longer. Generally within 3 minutes, it's unlikely that I haven't touched the camera in 3 minutes if I'm shooting any sort of sport. So that's, for me, 3 minutes is fine. Viewfinder off though, that's set to 1 minute. I think that's fine. So we go into bank 3. Screen viewfinder display is set to screen. I think that's fine. I don't have a problem there. Screen brightness is on 4. Viewfinder brightness is auto. And screen viewfinder color tone. Yeah, so you could set a different setting there, but I generally use 2, which is standard, and you can fine tune the VF color tone if you really wanted to. I think maybe if you're in a difficult lighting situation, you can change the color tone to maybe try and match the white balance setting. So we're now in the 4th bank of the yellow section of the menu system. Eye control off. I used it a few times. I've got to be honest, wasn't impressed. For sports, for accuracy of actually getting the subject in focus, I've got to be honest, it's really not worth using. Just take control of the focusing yourself. For me, I think it's a bit gimmicky. Maybe they helped sell a few extra cameras. For me, it wasn't the reason why I bought the R3. I didn't buy it for the eye control. I'm not going to use it, so that is off. Touch control is set to standard, and that's just the touch control on the back of the camera, the sensitivity of it. So yeah, that's set to standard. That's pretty good. Shutter at shutdown is closed. Sensor cleaning, we don't need to do that now, but auto cleaning at power off, yeah, fine, not a problem. So we're into bank 5 now, reset camera. We don't want to reset the camera, so leave that alone. Now, custom shooting modes. Now I'm going to come back to this later and show you how that works. Save, load cam settings on card, so you can save everything to the card. It's pretty useful. Battery information, yeah, pretty good, just telling you what's going on with the battery, and it also gives you the shutter count of the camera. So this one's pretty low, so I'm generally using electronic first curtain or the electronic shutter, so it's normally quite low. Copyright information, you can actually set the copyright information straight onto the camera, so every time a picture's taken, your copyright information will appear. I think I have done that in the past, but it's generally set in the metadata that I create separately. So I create a separate metadata sheet, and when I ingest photos onto the computer, that metadata is assigned. All my copyright info is generally stored in the metadata sheet, which I do on the computer, so I don't really need to do it on the camera, but you could do that if you wanted to. So now we're going back to the custom shooting mode, and you've got C1 to C3. So remember at the beginning, the different sort of shooting modes that you had 3 custom options at the end. So what we're going to do eventually, we're going to register all the changes that we've made on this camera, and we're going to assign it to C1, C2 or C3. I use C3. I don't know why, but I just use C3. So we're going to do that, and I'm going to set the custom shooting mode to C3. I'm not going to do it just now. We're going to carry on because there's a bit more to do. So exposure level increments, I've set that instead of half stops to third of a stop, just to give me a bit more flexibility. And I've done the same ISO speed setting increments to 1/3 stop instead of 1 stop. So I find that pretty useful. Don't need to bother with any of this. I'm not doing bracketing. Safety shift, I've never really understood exactly what it does to prevent under or overexposure in shutter priority AE modes, ISO mode to prevent under or overexposure in program shutter priority, aperture priority. I don't think it really matters that much, so I'm going to select ISO, but I really don't think it matters. So onto the second bank of this kind of orange section of the menu. Same expo for new aperture. Don't think it matters. Restrict shooting modes. You could basically eliminate some of the shooting modes that you have. I'm just going to leave it because you just never know what you're going to need to do. Probably not going to need bulb. You're most certainly going to need manual. You might need any of them. So yeah, I mean, bulb would be one that I would deselect, but I don't think it really matters. So you can also restrict the metering modes, but again, why would you want to do that? I mean, evaluative metering is set. It's unlikely that I will accidentally change those, so just leave it alone. Metering used in manual exposure. Okay, so that's fine as it is. Okay, this bit is an interesting one because we can set the shutter speed range. So mechanical or electronic first curtain, we can set the lowest speed to be something like 250th of a second. It's kind of like a safety shift really. It's not going to allow the camera to shoot anything below 250th of a second, but you can change it. You can change it to like 1/1000th of a second if you wanted to. So the camera will not physically shoot any lower than that shutter speed. So if you accidentally mess up all the settings or move something that you didn't mean to, the camera will physically not go below that. The idea is that you will always get a reasonably sharp picture, but I normally leave that at 1/500th of a second. But for this, I'm just going to leave it there. And aperture range, again, so you can do something similar with the aperture range if you wanted to, but for this, I'm not going to touch it. AE micro adjustments, yeah, again, never really needed to use it, might as well turn them on. Limit continuous shot count, no. Restrict drive modes, again, yeah, I mean, you could turn off the ones that you're really not likely to use. So the 3 at the end, probably not likely to use those, so we can just turn them off and just limit, you know, the functionality of the camera to just be the, you know, the core controls that you need. It's actually happened to me once before, accidentally on one camera. I had it on the 2-second delay and I was like, why is it not firing? And it was because it was accidentally set to 2-second delay. So here you can just do that, limit, sorry, what is it, the restrict drive modes. You can do that to turn them off. Okay, now we're into the 4th bank of this kind of orange section of the menu. Going into customized buttons. Okay, this is when it gets really interesting because we need to set up the back button controls on the camera. This is kind of where you have to really kind of pay attention a little bit. You've got all these buttons on the back, so we're going to assign customized control for the focusing system. For me, I think it's the only way to go. I think it's the best method for sports and wildlife, I've got to be honest. So, so at the top of the camera, which is the shutter button here, the one right at the top, we are going to change that. You can have metering AF start, but we're going to move it to metering start, and then we're going to move on, and movie shooting button could actually be assigned to something else. Not really going to be shooting movies, so it's a bit of a waste of a button really. It's just sitting there doing nothing. So what I generally do there is I set the movie shooting button to play, so that's my playback button. The reason I do that, because it saves me having to reach over where the default play button is. I've got all my main controls on this side of the camera, which I find much more useful. So these buttons down here, when you're in the field, it's very difficult to kind of reach across. You literally need to have 2 hands to control the camera. So I generally assign this kind of movie record button to be my playback button. I've got this little button at the top, which is normally called the multifunction button, or the MFN. I've set that to activate the menu. And again, because the menu button is right on the other side of the camera, you can see here. So the menu button is normally here. So if you want to access the menu really quickly, again, you need like 2 hands to be able to control it because you can't reach across. So by using the top one here, which I don't really need it for anything else, I'm able to access the menu really quickly if I want to change something in the camera, instead of having to reach across over here. So we've got this multifunction 2 button, which is normally set to start, stop tracking. I don't really use that for sports. I can understand maybe you'd want to use that, maybe in wildlife it would be better. I set the camera up with the back button focusing, and I've got eye tracking, and I've got a single point, and that's all I really need. So I don't really need the start-stop tracking. So I assign the multifunction 2 button, the button that applies the lock or the protect to the image. So I'll hit the playback button, which is now the video record button. It's now my playback button. So I hit record, and then on the front of the camera, I've got protect. So I can scroll through the images and I can hit protect. Again, by doing that, it just allows me to have all the controls on this side of the camera instead of on this side. So I don't need 2 hands to do everything. I can just do everything with 1 hand on this side of the camera. And that's really the reason why. So we've got the LCD panel illumination button. That I just leave that alone, not a problem. Mode, okay, left alone. AF on, which is metering and AF start. And yeah, you could change that to something, but generally I leave that alone because we've deactivated the metering on the shutter button, and I basically just want that to be assigned as a single point focusing on the back of the camera. So then you've got the Smart Controller Direct AF point selection, that's left alone. Then you've got AE lock button. So that is where I assign the eye detection AF. Now you could obviously assign anything to that. But that is my eye detection autofocusing button. AF point button, AF point selection. Now this is where it gets kind of interesting because I'm not likely to move or scroll through the various different focusing options. So I actually assign this button to be a register recall shooting function. Now, kind of quite interesting to have that set up. Now what that does, just in case you don't know, if you hit the info button, it allows you to set up a whole set of preset parameters. So when you press that button, the camera will then physically use the settings that you've set within the register recall shooting function. So you can set the shooting mode to be either program, or aperture, manual, or shutter priority, or you can just leave it unchecked. It will basically just use whatever the camera is set up to at the time of shooting. So the R3 for me is actually set on flexible priority mode. By unchecking shooting mode, the camera will basically just use whatever mode that you've got the camera set to at the time of shooting. So I just uncheck that, but you could have it set to shutter priority, manual, aperture, or program. I'll put it back to shutter priority, but it's unchecked. So shutter speed is interesting because you can literally set a predefined shutter speed. So if you're shooting sports, you probably want like 1/1000th of a second, basically. So I'm going to set it to that, and I'm okay with that. Right, the aperture. Now, the reason why I'm using this function is to kind of capture the action in sports games like football, rugby, maybe cricket, and sports like that. And I'm trying to capture moments when there's a lot of people grouped together. And it's because sometimes the spot focusing, single point focusing, doesn't focus on the person that I want it to focus on. And the eye tracking software is not reliable because it just could literally latch on to any person within that scene. So the idea is to have a much greater depth of field. Okay, so you have a shallow depth of field. If you want a shallow depth of field, then you shoot at 2.8. So say, for example, you have a 70-200 lens, you can shoot at f2.8. Well, it's going to give you a very, very narrow depth of field. So I want to have a greater depth of field, so I'm going to shoot at f8. If the camera were to somehow latch on to a person who's slightly behind the person I wanted to photograph, the chances are that f8 is still good enough for most of that scene to be in focus. So that's the reason why I'm setting it up. So the aperture is set to f8, ISO speed is set to auto, metering mode is set to evaluative metering, which is how the camera's set up anyway. Exposure compensation is on 0, but you could change that depending on the conditions. AF area, so you could uncheck that and it would basically use whatever the default camera setup is. So you could use any of these. You could use spot AF, 1 point AF, expand area. I've used expand AF area around. So to make sure that AF area is active, you actually have to go down to AF start position and make sure that it's set to manually selected AF point. That allows that AF area to be active. If you were to go down here and you were to select the registered AF point, then it kind of greys that AF area out. It makes it unusable. So you have to have AF start position to manually selected AF points. In turn, that allows the AF area to be active. Subject tracking is off. Subject to detect is set to people, but it's unchecked. So basically it will just use whatever the camera is set to. Spot detection is set to off. Eye detection is on, but again, it's unchecked, so you don't need to worry about any of these. AF operation is use AF. So that's been checked just to make sure that the AF operation is on. And that's basically it. So we go menu, that goes back. We want to hit this set button to OK that. So that's basically how I set up the sort of triple back button focusing with the 3 buttons on the back of the camera. Like I said, the usual button that's used for AF point button, I don't really use it when it comes to sport. Let's go back and see what that does. AF point selection button. I don't really need to change from 1 point AF or kind of single point. Never really had to do that. I'm either shooting at single point or I'm shooting eye tracking or autofocus tracking. That's pretty much it. So I don't really need to use that button. So that's the reason why I've kind of changed it to that kind of recall all, which I think is way more useful. You can actually be extremely creative with the register recall shooting function. You can literally set it to anything that you want. Let's go into info. Say for example, you wanted to use that as a function to do that kind of nice kind of motion blur, that kind of sort of panning effect, where you're keeping, you know, the subject's face in focus and everything around it's kind of blurred out. To do that, you would set the shutter speed down to like 1/50th or maybe slower 1/40th of a second. And you would have an aperture probably of about maybe f11. You'd have ISO on auto. Wouldn't really bother with metering, exposure compensation, white balance. That's another thing I would change. The white balance is actually set to auto white priority instead of just auto ambience priority. So that's worth noting. The AF area, you'd probably want it to be on 1 point AF. The subject tracking, you'd probably want off, because if you're panning, then there's no need to track the subject. You're already tracking the subject by panning. Subject to detect would be set to people. Spot detection would be probably off, maybe. Eye detection would be on, but it's on already on the camera, so you don't need to check it. Remember that you can check and uncheck everything. Tracking sensitivity, you could change to be more locked on. Acceleration, de-acceleration, again, you could alter that. Let's check that, tracking sensitivity. AF start position is manually selected AF point or registered AF point. Let's leave it on that for now. Let's check that. AF operation would be use AF. And so that's how you would set it if you wanted to do like a motion pan blur. So that's a really useful feature to have, so that you could set that button for that as well if you wanted to. So that's literally 3 buttons on the back of the camera that all do different functions. It's all helping you focus on your subject. So single point focus, really important, because it kind of overrides that kind of eye tracking. If the eye tracking isn't really working and it's not doing what it's supposed to do, or it's just very, very crowded scene and you just want to be very precise with your focusing, then you use single point focus. You've got the eye tracking. If you know a player is moving around, kind of locks onto their face or their eye and tracks the subject, works unbelievably well. And then you've got this 3rd button right at the end that's normally used for the AF point selection. I never really change. For me, during sports, I never really change it. So I don't really need that button. So I can assign that button to do so many other things depending on what I'm shooting. I either use it for like a situation where it's a crowded scene, like for a football game, say for example, a corner is coming in a football, like a soccer game, and there's lots of people in the box and it's very difficult to focus on a particular person. You have a setup that gives you a much deeper depth of field, so more of your scene is going to be in focus. So many times where I've been shooting at sort of f2.8, very shallow depth of field, and I've kind of missed focus on certain players. And so by doing this, it kind of overrides all your settings on your camera and gives you a much greater depth of field. So you've got a better chance of having more of your scene in focus. And that's the reason why I do it. The other way to use it, and there's lots of ways to use it, the other way would be to assign settings that allows you to do that kind of nice motion panning blur. Okay, so moving on to the next one down, which is the DOF preview button. Now, I generally set this to the cropping aspect ratio. So I'm able to basically use the camera's functionality to crop in from full frame to 1.6 times, which is going to give me around a 9.3 megapixel image still, cropping down from the 24 megapixels, which is the sensor on the R3. So not ideal, certainly not as good as the R5, where you got 45 megapixels. You use the cropping, the 1.6 times crop, you still got a 17 megapixel image. That's really fantastic. So there's a little bit of limitation with the R3, going from 24 megapixels down to 9.3. It's 1.6 times crop. Still probably more than usable for editorial photography, I would say. Sort of 9, 10 megapixels is still pretty good for most things. But the cropping mode is really, really useful if you just want to punch in and just get a little bit closer to your subject. I use it quite often, and which is the reason why I assign it to one of the buttons on the front of the camera. And you also have the option to do 1.1, 4:3, and 16:9 sort of aspect ratios. You know, it's kind of useful if you need to have that, but generally I just use either full frame or 1.6 times crop. So moving down the order, you've got the LFN button. This is a button that's normally on the lens, and I really don't bother with that at all because all the lenses are different. So the buttons are generally in different places, so I just don't really bother with that type of thing. If you're using a really, really large lens like a 400 f2.8, quite honestly, it's very difficult to get to those buttons anyway, so I generally just leave that one alone. And so next down the list, you've got the button that's in the middle of the scroll dial, which is set. So sometimes this is set to all auto, which allows you to reset all the settings that you've changed while in the FV mode, which is flexible priority mode. That's the mode I generally normally use for most things. But you can just reassign it to anything that you want. I mean, sometimes it's good to have the image replay or the magnify image. For this, I'm going to set it to going to set it to image replay. So next down the list, we have the multi-controllers. For some reason, by default, it's set to be off. I don't really understand why. So it's best to turn the direct AF point selection to be on instead of off. I mean, it's much more useful. And now going back to the smart controller, like I mentioned before, I really don't use this, so I prefer to have this turned off. I find the functionality of this really, really bad. You can even go into bank 5 of the kind of this orange menu section, and you can actually go into the smart controller and you're able to enable it and disable it. So I generally turn it off. I just don't use it at all. I find it really, really difficult and cumbersome to use. So just scrolling through the menu system here, looking at some other options. You can also have the option to add IPTC information. Now this is basically metadata information. So through the EOS Utility 3 app, or the EOS Utility app, you can actually load your metadata directly onto the camera, which can be quite useful if you're in a really, really tricky situation. Say for example, if you're unable to get the SD card out and load it onto a computer, you know that all your images contain the correct metadata. That can be quite useful. Now what we're going to do now, we are going to basically save all of these settings as a custom shooting mode. So you're going to get to this yellow section in the menu, and it's bank 5 of the yellow or mustardy sort of color in the menu section, and you're going to go to auto update to be enabled, and then you're going to scroll back up to register settings, and I'm going to go down to C3. I'm not really sure why I use C3, but I just prefer to use C3, and I'm going to assign or save all the settings that I've just changed within this tutorial as custom shooting mode C3. And you might notice in the top left corner it says C3 FV. So it's basically custom shooting mode 3, but the program mode is flexible priority or FV mode. And now you can see I'm kind of scrolling through the aperture and also the shutter speed, and you'll notice that because we set the minimum shutter speed to 1/250th of a second, it's not going to go any lower than that. But of course we can change that, and of course I can change the exposure compensation, and the ISO is set to auto, but I can actually change it and switch it back to auto. And then just moving on to some of the other functionality of the camera. So you've also got that kind of quick menu button, the Q button on the camera, really useful for all the extra features that we're unable to assign to dedicated buttons on the camera. So you've got metering mode. So this is actually really, really useful to have, the quick menu. So we've got metering mode if you needed to change that quickly. So your anti-flicker shooting or flicker detection. Sometimes the camera will detect if there's a flicker going on with the floodlights in the ground, so you're shooting, or if you're shooting indoors and there's really difficult lighting situations, most of the time for me it's going to be outdoors in a stadium with floodlights that are a certain type of floodlight. Sometimes they flicker really badly, so you can have the option of turning the flicker on. For me, it doesn't warrant to be assigned. For me, it's not important enough to be assigned to one of the buttons on the camera, but I can access it through the quick menu. So, I mean, it's off for now, but I can just turn it on very quickly. White balance settings, so like we mentioned before earlier on, auto white balance, but it's set to white priority. So it's AWBW. Now you can change that, obviously. You can change very, very quickly to any white balance settings that you want. You can also do some kind of micro color adjustments if you really, really need to. I mean, I've been in situations before where, yeah, the lighting's been really, really tricky, and I've actually had to go in and actually do some kind of color correction here within sort of white balance settings. Just remember just to move it back when you leave that sort of location. So white balance is a really easy one to get to, and like I mentioned, it's set to auto white priority by default. I generally find that to be way more accurate than set to auto white balance ambient priority. And then you've got the picture style. So if you need to make sort of micro adjustments to the picture style that we set previously, you can do that through the quick menu. I find that to be really, really useful. Subject to detect, you can change that on the fly as well. But if you're shooting sports, it's generally going to be cropping aspect ratio. We actually assign that to a button on the front of the camera, but you can also access that through the quick menu. Now, obviously, really, really important thing to be able to change is the AF area, because we took that off one of the buttons on the back of the camera, and we kind of reassigned that to recall all settings. But through the quick menu, you can still change it actually pretty quickly. So there's no reason for that to be assigned to a button. That's more for me. That's kind of more useful to be doing something else. And also the AF operation can be changed through the quick menu from one shot to servo. And also, if you really wanted to, you can change C-RAW and your JPEG settings. You can switch them around from different cards. I'm not sure why you'd want to do that. You're probably going to want to shoot RAW on the CF Express card and JPEG onto the SD card. But if you wanted to, you can just shoot JPEG to both cards if you think that's going to be better. And also you can change the drive mode through the quick menu, which you might want to take it off high speed continuous, maybe just a high speed, for example, and then we're back down to metering mode again. So we come out of that. So there's also buttons on the top left of the camera, and that's kind of interesting because you can also change the metering if you needed to really quickly, and you've got the exposure compensation that you can change, and you can change the servo AF from one shot to servo, and you can also change the drive mode from high speed continuous plus to high speed continuous, and so on and so on. So you've actually got two buttons assigned for that functionality on the top left of the camera. They cannot be customized in any way. So they're kind of stuck with that functionality. So it's worth bearing in mind when you assign, certain functions to certain buttons that there's lots of things that are kind of embedded into the camera that can't be changed. I think it's pretty useful having those buttons on the top there. So I think that's about it really. I think that kind of wraps everything up. I know, extremely long-winded tutorial. If you've made it this far, all I can say is thank you very much for sticking with it. But I think there's a lot of really useful things in this tutorial, even if there's lots of things that maybe you don't really agree with, and there's things that you'd prefer to do in a different way. That's perfectly fine. It's really down to you. It's your camera. You set it how you want. It's an extremely customizable camera. You really can do so much with it. So it's really down to you to kind of mold it in the way that you prefer to work. These are just some of the settings that I've started to use and some of the changes that I've made with the camera. I thought I'd kind of share with people just to maybe make you aware of the things that you can actually do with the camera. So thanks for sticking around. I hope you enjoyed it. If you liked it, give it a like, give it a share, and stay tuned for more tutorials.